We've got John Southworth with us next. We have gotten some questions about how we divided up the tracks. And while there was no set rhyme or reason, what we actually found was that we had a good chunk of case studies submitted this year. And case studies are some of our favorite things to bring to the summit because it not only talks about kind of the foundational approaches and the different ways that people tackle threat intelligence in their organization, but gives you concrete examples of how that can be done and what that looks like. And so John's talk is one of the first case studies we're presenting. There will be several more case studies on track 1 this afternoon. And what I think is fantastic about this talk is that, there are a lot of case studies where we read about them a lot in the news and we get people's takes and we have kind of this preconceived notion of what we're going to hear. But John's talk is one that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And he'll actually be able to kind of shed a lot of light into this intrusion. And up until I just saw in the hallway Slack, we've got a new sample as of this morning. So this is a very relevant, very actionable case study that is going to give us a lot of good information on how to apply CTI. And so, John, whenever you are ready, let's see.
Yeah, I should have control.
You got control? All right, perfect. Well, please take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you may be watching at the moment. I'm really honored to be able to speak here today alongside such talented researchers in order to be able to present my own research into a threat actor that I've been tracking for the past few months. My name is John Southworth, and I am a senior threat intelligence analyst at PwC UK. My primary role in the team is to track threat actors based in the Asia Pacific region. When I started, that was initially looking at North Korea-based threat actors, such as the Lazarus Group. But more recently, I've also been looking at China-based threat actors. But I also look into more unknown intrusion sets, and this is what today's talk is going to be about. The primary way that I conduct my research is through the malware analysis of advanced persistent threat groups and reverse engineering those samples in order to understand the capability of the threat actor. Through that process, I will obtain infrastructure, such as command and control infrastructure of the malware, which I can then go and look at and analyze to go and find further infrastructure. And a little bit about myself. I don't know about you, but I've had a bit more free time over the last year for whatever reason. And I've used that opportunity to pick up again playing jazz piano. And while I don't have my keyboard with me at the moment, I will maybe try and figure out a way in the future to integrate that into further talks. But yes, if you do have any requests as well, please do put them on the Slack channel. So what would I like you to get out of this talk today? Before I dive into analyzing the campaigns themselves, I want to give a bit of context as in how these campaigns were found. I think that will be interesting to give some context on the techniques that are being used, how I'm tracking them, and it might give you some thoughts for your own threat hunting. I'm then going to dive into the malware family that I've called xStart, provide some high-level analysis of the malware family, talk about how I've automated up some of the processing of the analysis for the samples, and give some tips and tricks onto how to track the malware family. I'll then take all of the infrastructure that I've obtained through tracking xStart, analyze that and give you some thoughts on the themes of the domain registrations and the IP addresses used for infrastructure, and how to find more samples and more infrastructure. I'll then take the decoy documents that are dropped by samples of xStart and displayed to the victim and show that how they can show some likely targeting of these campaigns. I'm then going to finish up by giving some points on attribution, or why I haven't attributed this to any known threat actors at this stage, and some ideas for further research into these campaigns. Now, throughout the talk, all of the indicators, YARA rules, and scripts that I'm going to be referencing, you can get at the link on screen. I've also shared this in the Slack channel, but if you don't get a chance to look at it now, I will also be sharing a link again at the end of the presentation. So first things first, I need to give a little bit of context into the technique of DLL search order hijacking. This is where a threat actor can take advantage of the fact that a legitimate executable will try to load a code library or a DLL in a specific search order, such as next to in the same directory as the executable itself. In this, they can take their own malicious DLL implants, put them alongside the legitimate binary, and load and execute their own malicious code. The benefit of this technique is that if you take a sample such as winword.exe, rather a binary such as winword, and there are lots of DLL hijacking candidates out there, but winword in particular we've seen being used by threat actors over the last year. And if you rename it, you can make it look like it's actually a Word document, which might make it more likely that a victim is going to double click on the sample. Some extra steps that I've observed threat actors taking in order to make this look like a more legitimate approach is to give the corresponding DLL file for winword, which is called www.lib.dll, the hidden file attribute so that the victim might not even see the DLL on disk. And another technique that threat actors have also used is the right to left override technique, where they take a specific Unicode character, which will flip the last few characters of the string of the file name, and they can make it look like it has a .doc extension, which might increase the likelihood that the victim double clicks on the sample. Now in 2020, the team at PwC have seen several threat actors using this technique for winword and www.lib.dll specifically, including Mustang Panda and its offshoot known as Red Delta, and the threat actor known as Ocean Lotus or APT32. Now, the challenge that threat actors have in this approach is that in order to make it work, they have to send two files to the victim, the legitimate executable and the DLL that they want to hijack. In order to do this, a convenient way is to package them up in a compressed archive and send them as a spear phishing attachment. Now, in order to detect that kind of activity, I've gone away and written what is called a YARA rule. So for those who are not familiar with YARA, it is a way of writing rules so that you can look for specific strings and files and then match those strings based on more complicated conditions than you would with just a regex alone. And these two rules that you can see here will go and look for zip archives and RAR archives, which contain the string www.lib.dll. If you go and look at these YARA rules yourself and use them across various data sources, you will be able to find Mustang Panda zip files, Ocean Lotus RAR archives, and more. And one of those samples in particular that I picked up towards the end of last year is the one you can see on screen. Now, what was interesting about this sample and what caught my eye was the file name of the zip file itself. And as you can see, it's referencing this thing called National Day and preparation for the network and public opinion security of this event. Now, the National Day in China is an event that happens at the beginning of October. That's a big public holiday. And in this zip file was contained the legitimate version of winword.exe, renamed to make it look like a Word document, and a malicious www.lib.dll file. However, when I looked at this www.lib file, it didn't look like anything I'd seen before. And this is where the investigation into these campaigns began. So what is xStart? Well, xStart is a shellcode loader that will also drop and open a decoy document to be displayed to the victim. And on the right, you can see an example, in this case, the decoy document dropped by the sample I showed on the previous slide, which also contains this title, which is China Datang. We'll get on to how the decoy documents can talk about targeting later on. And xStart in this case will take the form of the www.lib.dll file. The shellcode that it loads will attempt to download and execute the Cobalt Strike beacon module via HTTP. How do I know that it's trying to download Cobalt Strike? Well, at PwC, we perform active scanning for specific malware families command and control servers. And in this case, for the samples of xStart that I was able to obtain and look at the command and control servers, I could see that they were already tagged up in our systems as Cobalt Strike. Not only that, but antivirus vendors that have signatures for xStart, in many cases, will also have detected them as Cobalt Strike droppers. The shellcode that is loaded isn't executed in the same process as www.lib.dll itself, but rather is injected into one of the following processes that you can see on the screen. And the name xStart itself comes from a string in the binary, and I'm showing at the bottom here some pseudocode output where you can see the string xStart. Now, I've taken this campaign and mapped it out in more of a visual way because I think it is useful. There's not too much new information on this slide that I haven't shared already. I'm going to give an example of a spear phishing email used in these campaigns later. But the thing I haven't pointed out so far is a technique used in some samples of xStart, which is the UAC bypass technique. Now, there's nothing too important to say about this. It has likely been adopted from open source code that the threat actor has taken from the GitHub repository. But this will allow the threat actor to raise privileges on the infected system before it deploys Cobalt Strike. And then when Cobalt Strike is deployed, it can start gathering system information and laterally moving throughout the network. So that is xStart at a high level. Let's dive into the internals of it in a little bit more detail. So the way that both the decoy document and the shellcode are delivered to the victim system is that they are stored in portable executable resources that are encrypted. The decoy document will be written to disk in place of the original executable and DLL, which will be deleted at runtime, so that the victim might believe that they have actually opened a decoy document or a legitimate document. Whereas the shellcode, when it is downloaded, will only be in memory through the code injection process. And remember the resource names themselves, MKV for the decoy document and MP4 for the shellcode, as we'll be referencing them a bit later as well. Now, it makes sense that the threat actor doesn't want to just store the decoy document and the shellcode as plain text. After all, it would be fairly obvious that it is shellcode, and you would be able to look through that shellcode and see the domains that are going to be used or the IP addresses where it's going to be downloading the next stage. So what the threat actor has done is encrypt them using AES 128 in cipher block chaining mode. Now, the key to decrypt the resources is stored in the binary itself as a plain text string, which will be MD5 hashed and passed to the Windows API crypt-derived key. Based on this information, this is actually enough for us to already automate up some of the processing of xStart samples. After all, we're going to be interested in the configuration of the shellcode and where it's going to be trying to download the Cobalt Strike beacon module. So I set out to write an autoconfig extractor. And I chose to do this in Python 3, as Python is a very nice language when it comes to writing up quick scripts that are very portable. And my goals were this. First of all, I want to pass out the AES 128 key from the binary. I secondly want to be able to load those portable executable resources and then decode them. And thirdly, I want to be able to pass any indicators of compromise out of that shellcode that could be of interest. Now, Python has a lot of nice inbuilt packages that can help facilitate this, but in particular, I've used two external packages, PyCryptoDome, which will help me with the AES decryption, and PEFile, which will help with the portable executable passing in order to get those resources. Now, there are a couple of challenges to this approach that I found when I was writing this up. In particular, I was getting some false positives when I was trying to pass out the AES key, but I think I got a regex that's specific enough to get the key out consistently. But perhaps a more interesting problem, and one that I've actually encountered as a reverse engineer in the past as well, is this implementation of crypto-derived key. For specific cryptographic algorithms and hashing families, crypto-derived key has a non-trivial implementation that we would have to write up ourselves in order to correctly derive the cryptographic key. But fortunately, this has already been done in the past. In particular, FireEye, in one of the solutions to their CTF called Flare-On, actually wrote up a Python 2 version of this implementation. So I was able to take that and adapt it for my own use in my Python 3 script. And I think this is a good opportunity to highlight that CTFs like this are not just valuable in practicing our skills as analysts, but can also provide these solutions to real-world problems. And in this case, this was a very real solution that I've used several times in my research, and you'll be able to find this function and the GitHub repository I was talking about earlier. With all that, I was able to actually implement this autoconfig extractor for xStart and can use that to aid in my analysis. And I've taken a screenshot of the output of running it over the sample I was talking about earlier and highlighted some key components. In particular, where the AES key is being passed out, where a domain is being passed out of the shellcode itself, and where a URI path that will be requested off of that domain has also been passed out. For convenience as well, I also save this data out as a JSON file on disk, which will contain any domains or IP addresses found, all of the HTTP headers that will be used, and the path that will be requested itself. And the nice thing about putting it in this format is that this can immediately be ingested into any systems that you want to use. So for instance, at PwC, I can push this to our backend systems for querying by other analysts immediately. So that is analyzing xStart in a bit more detail, and hopefully now we understand the functionality of it. But how can we find more samples? Well, again, I'm going to be writing YARA rules in order to find and classify more samples of xStart. And there are three approaches that I take usually when I'm writing these rules. The first is that I will look at the plain text strings in the binary itself, which you can obtain by running a strings utility tool, or some portable executable parsers will automatically do that for you. And I've highlighted a few key strings that are unique enough to find more samples of xStart. Now, the string xStart itself isn't unique enough to actually find more samples, but the format string that you can see at the top there with the %s is. Another string of interest is this next one down, which is the unit AES unit func string. This is likely some kind of artifact in the compilation process, maybe referencing unit tests. But this string combined with that tab character in the middle, again, is a very good indicator that we can use for writing our rules. We don't have to rely just on the strings of files, however. We can also look at the metadata of the portable executable itself. Given it is a unique file format, there is some data that we can work with. One in particular is the import hash. That is where you will take the import address table, so all the code libraries needed to be used by the malware family, hash that table, and use the fact that because the table usually is fairly uniquely ordered, you will be able to find more samples by doing the same for other portable executables. And you can write YARA rules for that. But like I said earlier, these resource names that we've seen, that is MKV and MP4, are also unique when it comes to them being combined together. And we can use them to also write a YARA rule to find more samples. And finally, we don't have to just rely on any of those, but we can actually dig a bit deeper and look at the code itself. The screenshot that I've shared on this slide is some disassembly output in the run-up to the call of cryptography key in xStart. And instead of this function using local variables to pass parameters into the cryptography key API, instead what is being used is a unique structure. And because that structure has unique offsets as well, such as with unique offsets into the EDI register, I can actually take that code as it is, put that in a YARA rule as a hex string, and find more samples as well. And the benefit of doing all of these approaches is that that built-in redundancy means that if the threat actor changes up any one of these parts, I will still have ways of being able to detect the malware in other means. When I went and used those rules, I was able to find a bunch more samples, which I can highlight some key facts at a high level. First of all, xStart has been used since at least October 2019, based off of the portable executable compilation timestamp. Now, in some cases, this timestamp had been what's called time-stomped, where the threat actor has gone and purposefully modified it. But those cases were fairly obvious, and I was able to exclude them. There might be samples earlier than that date, but from the data that I have access to, that was as far back as I could go to find them. Not only that, but other DLLs were also used for search order hijacking in xStart campaigns, including qt5gui.dll, which is part of the Qt graphical user interface framework. And I believe it's pronounced boopdate.dll, which is used as part of Google Chrome. One variant as well had shellcode that would use a slightly different approach to all the other shellcode variants. Rather than using HTTP to download the next stage payload, it would use DNS, where it would repeatedly make DNS requests of subdomains of the C2, get the text response, and load that. And the reason I want to highlight this is because a sample that I shared in the Slack channel for this talk a little bit earlier was one that I actually found today, which also uses this DNS shellcode variant, and the compilation timestamp was today. So that shows that these campaigns are still going, the threat actor is still active. I took all of the compilation timestamps of these samples and mapped them out to give a rough idea of when the activity of this threat actor has been. So in particular, you can see at the start, these campaigns at the end of 2019 in October, then a big gap in time for several months, and then suddenly a burst of activity in the second half of 2020, with it peaking around September. With a bit more context later on, I think I can give a good hypothesis as to why there's this gap in the middle. But we'll get onto that a little bit later. So far up until this point, I've been discussing mainly the capability of xStart. So let's pivot over to the infrastructure side of things instead, and take all of the command and control servers obtained from these xStart samples and look at them. For the domains themselves, there were particular themes around the domain registrations. In particular, some of the domains I'm highlighting here were spoofing Alibaba, which is also known as Alian. The second domain, Didion, looks like it's themed in a similar way to the Alian spoofing domain, but it's not quite clear if it's exactly the same thing. Another domain used in an xStart campaign was spoofing financial services in China. The domain here is China Clear, and the domain it's trying to spoof, the legitimate one, is China Clear, which is the China Securities Depository and Clearing Corporation, which is part of financial services in China with relation to stock exchanges. And I'll be referencing that in particular later on in these slides, so bear that domain in mind. When it comes to the IP addresses that were being resolved to by these domains, and in the cases where IP addresses were hard-coded in the configuration of xStart samples, the infrastructure and the hosting providers that the threat actor prefers to use is predominantly Chupa, but also Alibaba, which makes sense given that they're spoofing some of the domains for Alibaba as well. Now, across campaigns, I observed several samples of xStart actually reusing IP addresses. And in the cases of domains, it would use the same domain, but use a different subdomain on those domains. And with that information, we can actually just find more infrastructure by looking at more subdomains of a domain in question. And I picked out some key ones that show some interesting themes. The first one, Cassie Cloud, is in reference to another cloud service provider in China. And the second two, Hangzhou and Hubei, are referencing regions in China. This regex pattern that's on the right is something to consider if you want to try and find similarly themed infrastructure. We have access to a system at PwC that will look at domains, all the newly registered domains, which we can then apply our own regex patterns over the top of to find similar themed infrastructure. And if we take all of the IP addresses that we've seen and look at the passive DNS resolutions to them, that is, domains that have previously resolved to those IPs, but not necessarily anymore, we can also find further infrastructure that way, such as one that is spoofing Microsoft, another that is spoofing a cloud service provider, although I'm not convinced that TangCloud actually exists, I can't find any reference to it, and one that specifically references China in the domain itself. We've talked about capability, we've talked about infrastructure. Now we can talk about some likely targeting based off of the decoy documents that are being dropped by xStart. Now I want to make clear that I'm not going to, I can't name particular organizations that are being targeted by xStart because that would not be possible to infer directly from the decoy document targeting. But it can be enough to infer some likely sector targeting, so more at a high level. In the appendices to these slides, I provided a more detailed breakdown of the decoy documents observed so far, in case you'd like to see where this kind of logic is coming from. But in all the cases that I'm mentioning here for a likely target sector, I've observed several lures that likely fit that sector. This first one claims to be a complaint form from an employee and mentions in particular the Three Gorges Information System Development Project. Now, the Three Gorges Dam is one of the largest hydroelectric dams in the world and is based in China. Therefore, the likely target sector in this case could be energy or utilities. The second document I wanted to share with you is titled Feedback from Jianbank Oracle Software Product Maintenance Service Bidding, and it looks like an invitation to bid for a project. Now, given that it's mentioning both this bank in particular and Oracle software, this could be a mixture of a likely target sector of financial services or technology. For financial services, I have some more interesting lures that I want to show later, but in particular, another one that is likely targeting the technology sector is this lure, which is describing a building sweep of the software company Kuaishou, which develops a popular social media app in China, ahead of a visit of a celebrity who's popular in China called Yang Mi. Therefore, the likely targeted sector of this lure is technology. And finally, this one is a little bit more tenuous, but I wanted to include it anyway for context. This claims to be a job application from someone named Wang Wei, and it gives the address of Shanghai's municipal government headquarters building in the lure itself. So while I don't think it's fair to say that the likely target sector is government, I'm more confident saying it's a realistic probability. So not quite as strong, but one could infer from the actual contents of the lure itself, that kind of targeting. So like I mentioned earlier, xStart is usually delivered via a zip file or a RAR archive that'll be attached to a phishing email. And in one of these cases, I was able to actually obtain the phishing email itself that was delivering xStart, in particular with a renamed WinWord and the www.dll file in the zip. Now, while I've redacted the actual main parts of the email address, you can see the domain that they were hosted on and targeting, and that is ChinaClear.com. And again, I mentioned earlier some infrastructure that was spoofing ChinaClear, also known as the China Securities Depository and Clearing Corporation. So this shows almost certain targeting of not only this organization, but the financial services sector in general. So to summarize all of that targeting information up, the likely target sectors of these xStart campaigns are financial services, insurance, energy and utilities, and technology, with a realistic probability target sector being government. All the lures observed so far have been written in Mandarin, and the majority of samples have been uploaded to an online multi-antivirus scanner from China. So combining the fact of that information with the themes of the domains themselves, also spoofing cloud service providers and financial services in China, I would say it is almost certain that this threat actor is interested in targeting organizations based in China. Now on to the point of attribution. And before I talk about this, I want to make clear that I believe attribution is important. Attribution allows us to take atomic IOCs and connect them to a larger intrusion set to immediately gain context into the tactics, techniques, and procedures of threat actors. And if we can tie it back to a country of origin, that means that we can also gain strategic context into that targeting. So counterintuitively, why I believe it's important is why I haven't attributed this campaign or these campaigns, because I just don't think there is enough evidence to connect this activity to any known threat actors at this stage. When I was originally looking at this, my bias, and I'm not sure if you would think the same, but my bias initially was that this could be Ocean Lotus. After all, Ocean Lotus also uses Cobalt Strike, also uses this www search order hijacking technique, and also targets China. But if you take any of those pieces of evidence, and the point of us as threat intelligence analysts is not to build up evidence in order to support a hypothesis, but rather to find evidence in order to reject all other hypotheses. And in this case, any of those pieces of evidence on their own could also point to it either being another threat actor, such as it being a shared technique or a shared tool, or it just being an unknown threat actor that we haven't actually classified yet. And while that might be disappointing in terms of not being able to get a definitive attribution for this set, the fact that we can define it as a new set and gain all of this context around the techniques it's using can be incredibly valuable. And I'm really thankful that I am given the opportunity in my day job to look into these more niche intrusion sets and threat actors and to understand their tactics, techniques, and procedures. So in all, we track this activity internally at PwC as White Dev 50. This is a similar naming to FireEye's naming convention for unknown threat actors. And to summarize all of its main points, the capability displayed by White Dev 50 is this unique xStart dropper, which will load Cobalt Strike via this DLL search order hijacking technique. The infrastructure used spoofs Allian or Alibaba, but also will spoof financial services based in China using Chupa and Alibaba hosted infrastructure. And the victims are mainly based in China, well, all based in China from what we've observed so far, in the financial services sector, energy and utilities sectors, and so on. Now, to wrap up my thoughts on this threat actor, I first of all want to provide some thoughts on endpoint detection. And if you haven't read a blog by my colleague at PwC, MITRE, he wrote a really good blog on hijacking DLLs in Windows that I think you should check out, because it gives some really good context as to all the different kind of candidates for DLL search order hijacking and some recommendations. In particular, if you are looking for DLL search order hijacking, look for DLLs that are being created in or loaded from unconventional file paths. When it comes to code injection, check if processes such as run DLL32 that you don't expect should be making network connections, if they are, because that might be an indicator of malicious activity. And finally, you can take these YARA rules that I've written that you can find on the GitHub repository to scan email attachments, not just for xStart samples themselves, but for this more threat hunting technique of trying to find zip or RAR archives which contain these DLL hijacking candidates. So you could adapt them not just to use the www.lib.dll, but also use different DLLs as well. There's also some avenues for further research when it comes to these xStart campaigns. In particular, a couple of samples were signed with digital certificates. This sample, when translated, the name of the certificate is Elcian Labco. And this sample has a name which is signed by Eagle Investments LLC. If I take all of the samples that I found that were also signed with these certificates, I'm left with some more clusters, which of over 60 samples, many of which are tagged by antivirus vendors as Cobalt Strike or MITRE. Now, a lot of these use the DLL search order hijacking technique, but are also using this fake Flash player installer in order to run them on the infected system. And there is also more Alibaba theming around the domain registrations, such as this Allianz domain. Now, if I take those samples and I look at the compilation timestamps again, they align nicely with the other xStart campaigns. In particular, we have some campaigns at the end of 2019, then a gap in time, then resumed activity mid-2020. And I think that a potential reason why there's that gap in the middle, or my hypothesis, is that given the threat actor is targeting China, during those months, the COVID pandemic was at its peak. That's not to suggest that the threat actor is necessarily based in China, although that is certainly a possibility, more so that the organizations that it were targeting might not have been as active during those months. You can find in these slides all of the detailed descriptions of the Decoy documents that I found and the likely target sectors that they might be going after. I've also included all the references to MITRE attack that this threat actor has displayed, as they give a really good high-level context as to these techniques and an opportunity of explaining them. And you can also find my references to further threat actors that are using this DLL search order hijacking technique, Vitz's blog, and the various scripting packages that I've used. Finally, have a look at the GitHub repository for my indicators of compromise, YARA rules, and scripts. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present. And if you have any questions, please let me know.